Hello and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we're going to be talking about bidirectional and the things that you need to be aware of when it comes to the new devices and the regulations. My name is Jake Green, I'm the Head of Technical Engagement here at the Scolmore Group, and I'm joined by Marcus Barrett, who's the Technical Engagement Engineer. He's new to us, so if you haven't seen him on the channel, please do show him some love. Always.
Yeah, always.
So where do we want to start, Marcus? What's the sort of place in time we need to go back to, I suppose, is probably the question.
Yeah, so I think what we need to look at first of all is what we mean maybe by bidirectional and actually what sort of has caused that problem. And we sort of have to look at actually how power flow is flowing through our devices, especially with the integration of things like solar, battery storage systems, EV, etc., where power is actually going to be flowing in bidirectional properties.
So if we think about solar PV, then that's been around for years now, hasn't it? You know, we go back to probably 2018, maybe even just before then. That's when it started kicking off. We had the big boom where we've seen feed-in tariffs of 47 pence, etc. So I think the first question to ask really is, has it always been an issue, or is it something that's new and been brought to light with the uptake in solar PV in the last couple of years, especially with people thinking about energy prices and so on and so forth?
It's not really old or new, Jake. So what we have is a new way of thinking for actually an old problem. So solar PVs are effectively, even though the equipment's changed, the regulations have changed around them, they've worked in the same way for years and years and years. So power is always going to flow in a different direction. And therefore, even though we have this new way of thinking with our protective devices and how they work, it's actually an old problem as well.
Okay, well, I think, you know, looking at it, I fitted solar panels years and years and years ago. Never ever really seen this problem, so you know there's probably that to consider as well when we start to look at the testing requirements under 7671, doing the EICRs, etc. Where do we go from that? So we'll touch on that as well. So let's start then right at the beginning, Marcus, in terms of the two devices. So we've got bidirectional devices and unidirectional devices. Now on the 31st of July 2024, there was an Amendment 3 that was brought in to support the changes around these devices, and it was really to sort of push it forward and make sure that people were understanding that we do need to think about the way we're doing, and we do need to take into consideration the direction of flow of current in these particular installations. So we've got two sets of devices in front of us here then, Marcus. You've got the same as me, and I've got two here. One thing we have noticed is that one's slightly taller, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? And we never noticed that before. We were saying before we started shooting the video, actually, we didn't know that they were slightly different designs in terms of the height. So
one thing that we want to sort of point out straight away is that with our particular devices, there is a set code on there which will give you a reference to the bidirectional device. So it's always important just to double check, and we've made it quite clear and easy for people to see straight away, without even taking the cover off, that they can identify whether something is a bidirectional device as well. The other thing that I'm noticing about here, Marcus, is the markings on there.
Yeah.
So we've got some different markings. Again, we'll just touch on them in a moment. But one's bidirectional, one's unidirectional. So give me the terms and tell me what they actually mean.
Yeah, so effectively unidirectional, uni being one, means that power can only flow in one direction. And that will be classic to the protective devices we've used for years and years and years. But when we're looking at bidirectional, we're actually thinking it can flow in two different directions.
Okay, so moving on to the markings then, what do we need to think about when we look at devices? Because I would imagine that there are maybe some devices that are on the market, you know, I'm just sort of thinking about our double modular RCDs or RCCBs. They would have been bidirectional by nature, but they would have had slightly different markings on them as well. So what markings do we have on these devices that we need to make sure we're looking out for? Yeah,
so when we're looking out at the devices, for our unidirectional, we would generally see points of connection where it talks about in and out. So we'll have line in, and then we may have line and neutral out. Whereas the bidirectional, it's a good point you bring up regarding RCDs and MCBs. By nature, they never really say out or in. So they're bidirectional by nature. So when we look at the bidirectional devices now, we can identify quite easily that they're bidirectional by the fact that they don't have out and in labelled on them. Now they may still have line and neutral. They may have a number, ours indicates a number and an N for neutral, and that's for polarity reasons. That's not for the direction of power flow. So even though you still see line and neutral, that is purely for polarity concerns, but no out and in anymore.
Okay. So in terms of things that people need to consider when they're out on installations.
Yeah.
Should they always be fitting bi-directional devices? It doesn't matter what the installation is. Is it sort of a, let's move away from unidirectional devices and go straight to bi-directional all the time?
No, definitely not. And the amendment wasn't brought in for that. And it's one of them things with the regulations, isn't it? Sometimes an amendment comes in, and we've seen it with SPDs, for instance. It come in, and it maybe didn't mean that every installation has an SPD, but as electricians, we jump on it and we say, right, it's going everywhere, it's going everywhere. It's just important that we look at actually what load is connected to this device. So if we have something that is classed as a generating set or generates power that will flow back to the grid or flow in a different direction, it's important then under that regulation that we look at installing a bi-directional device.
So the regulation then that actually talks about this, where does it sit within the regulations? Because maybe people haven't looked upon that particular regulation in great detail.
Yeah, so it actually sits under Part 5, Jake, and it sits under 530.3.201.
Okay, so 201 is quite interesting then, because that obviously means it's a UK-specific regulation, which, you know, they're talking about the level of safety. You would have thought that if that was the case, it would have been a worldwide standard. Now, we do know that people across the continent are already using these devices. I think it's the sudden urgency to bring it in would have meant that we actually need to create our own regulation, essentially.
Yeah, of course, just to get it in there quick. And again, before the drop of the DPC for Amendment 4, they brought this in effectively straight away, didn't they? So.
Yeah. I mean, there wasn't any real comment that could have been made on it. There was no, you know, backwards and forwards. It was like, no, this needs to be done. Yeah. We're going to do this, and hats off to the IET. They've moved quickly on this one. So in terms of testing then, we will still test them the same as we would with a standard RCBO? Yeah,
but they'll still be tested exactly the same. We will still only be required to test them at times when their value, record the value we need to on the test paperwork.
And there's no requirement for us to make sure that they are operating in the other direction. We have to sort of almost trust the product standard.
Yeah, of course you do. And I always bring it back to this thing with testing RCDs and stuff is, how many people test MCBs? You know, we rely on the manufacturer to actually sell us a product or provide us with a product that does what it says, and it's very similar in that terms. We can't open it up and check that it's officially bi-directional. We can look at drawings on the side of the device maybe, but we trust that manufacturer.
You did mention here that we do have some drawings on the side, and that does indicate that these are bi-directional devices as well. For you people out there that are testing, whether it's you know, new installations or whether you're doing the ICR, that's something else that needs to be taken into consideration, because we need to start understanding how we code these installations. We've seen lots of PV installations out there. We've seen thousands and thousands. What do we think, or what do you suggest we do when it comes to testing these devices on an EICR? What code are we starting to see if it isn't a bi-directional device? Yeah, so it's quite a good question really, because other than bi-directional, before we were looking at the types of RCD, weren't we? We was looking at actually, if there's DC present, are we going to install a type A, a type B, and we would code considering that. And there was lots of things where if we tested it under load and it actually performed the test correctly, we might be able to see through it. But for me, with the use of the bi-directional, the problem with the bi-directional is in fact that if there is an earth fault, let's say, at one side of it, it might not trip. Therefore, there's a potential of danger there in terms of a fault occurring and it not disconnecting. So for me, I'm probably going to recommend it, if I'm the inspector, a C2, but you know yourself, it's up to the inspector to decide. All we can do is give guidance and work along with the other competent person schemes, etc., for what they guide to as well. Yeah, so it's interesting, you know, Mark's mentioning there about the actual testing of these devices, and when we start to look at the types, this is slightly different. We need to look at it in a slightly different way. Yes, when we look at the types, there's a bit of DC present, but they are still performing as they should be. But this one here could be potential to not clear the fault entirely. Yeah. So, you know, if it was a unidirectional device and it had a fault on it coming back the other way, we're suggesting that potentially it could maybe not clear the fault. Yeah, and therefore you have that potential for danger, and therefore it's a C2. It's not immediately dangerous. You're not going to be able to give it a C1 code based on the fact it's not bi-directional, because it's not immediately dangerous. It only becomes dangerous if there is a fault there, which for me would lead, like you said, to C2. Yeah, you'll have to let us know what you think in the comments on that one, because again, as Marcus has mentioned, it is all to do with the inspector. You know, that's down to you guys that are out there on the tools on the daily, carrying out the EICRs. It's just, one of those ones where what we don't want to happen is people go into an installation and go, C2 has failed straight away.
Yeah.
There needs to be some consideration around it. You also need to look at maybe the thermals that are going on with the installation. Is there any thermal damage to the devices as well? That's another question you need to be asking yourself once you are carrying out that EICR. So is there anything else you want to talk about, Marcus?
Yeah, so if we looked at regulation 826.1.2.2, and we can look at that, talks about having the consideration of polarity and power flowing in both directions. And it might be sort of a question to ask is, well, actually, if we're a prosumer and we're not working off of the grid, let's say our inverter is providing us in island mode, etc., do we need a bidirectional device there?
Well, that's a good question because, you know, if you're complete island mode, then you're only going to only have power in one direction. But if you are still linked to the grid because you are a prosumer, then of course we're going to need to take into consideration both of those directions of power flow.
And generally, because loads such as inverters are connected to the load side of these devices, it's very important that even though we might just be working off of that inverter, that actually, because it's connected to the load side and it's providing power the other way, it would still need to be bidirectional. So even though we might only have power going one way all the time, it can't be a unidirectional, it still needs to be a bidirectional device.
One of the things that we probably want to consider as well is the fact that these devices over the sort of the last couple of years have become important in disconnecting both live conductors as well. So we need to take that into consideration. That sits under, I believe it's just looking over it, it's 415.1. It says that for connecting a circuit to a generating set to the installation, the RCD must disconnect all live. So the bidirectional devices will be switch neutral as well, ensuring that we do meet that requirement of 415.1 as well.
Yeah, and when we look at maybe EV vehicles, we know that we should disconnect all live conductors there with the device. And it might be that your EV doesn't provide power, but there's big pushes in industry to get this vehicle to grid, do they call it? So again, you might be considering using a bidirectional device for an EV install because of that capability of the battery of the car supplying power to the grid as well.
So one final thing then to mention is that they do come in a B curve and a C curve in our range, that is. You know, there may be others that are on the market, but they do come in both types. So if you are looking at some that are slightly higher, maybe if you're looking at sort of heat pumps later on down the line and what have you. I know they don't necessarily have the direction, but it may be a consideration that you need to take into account because of the higher load.
Yeah, and manufacturers of big battery storage systems or battery storage systems sometimes dictate that it should be a C curve. So yeah, we've catered for that as well. And the RCD type is a type A as well, Jake. So
yeah. So stay tuned for more information on this because we will be bringing you some, whether it's about product or whether it's about the regulations. Don't forget, like, subscribe and share, and we'll see you on the next one.